let me give you two theological ideas, two categories that are important in our discussion, and then let's look at the text of Scripture. Genesis 2:15 places Adam and Eve, the narrative of Scripture, in the garden, and I read to you from Genesis 2:15, this is before the fall. This is before sin, and Adam is pictured as needing to work, as being called to work. We're going to talk more about that, but there are a couple of key theological distinctions that we need to make if we really want to understand a Protestant theology of work. So number one is the distinction between nature and grace. Nature and grace. To help us a little bit with that, when we say nature and grace, we could say perhaps creation and redemption. Creation and redemption. The reason that this is an important kind of theological idea is because Roman Catholics, by the time of the medieval period, held the view that the natural was devalued. That nature itself was lacking something and needed to be added to. And that was where grace comes in. God's work in redemption fills out nature. Now that may sound innocent enough. And we would say, well, isn't there something wrong with the world now after the fall? And the answer, of course, is yes. The fall, of course, means that we as human beings have been plunged into sin, but the world has been cursed. It's under a curse, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But by the medieval period, Rome would essentially say that nature is lacking. And thus, the natural is lacking and needs to have something added to it. So, for instance, we find Martin Luther, the great reformer that I'm sure all of you have heard of, writing in the Babylonian captivity of the church, the following quote: "Therefore I advise no one to enter any religious order or priesthood unless he is forearmed with this knowledge and understands," and then here's what he wants us to understand, "that the works of monks and priests, however holy and arduous they may be, do not differ one whit in the sight of God from the works of the rustic laborer in the field, or the woman going about her household tasks, but that all works are measured before God by faith alone." Now, if you know anything about Martin Luther, you're probably familiar with that phrase, faith alone. But he applies it to vocation. And again, the idea that only those who were in religious callings could use the word vocation or calling was something that began to be rediscovered and changed during the Reformation. Writing on work, one scholar, Veith, says this, kind of a secondary source, a background source on what was happening during the Reformation in Luther. He says this: "According to Luther, God calls each of us to various tasks and relationships. We have vocations in the family, which, Lord willing, will be talked about tomorrow, marriage and parenthood. In the workplace, as master, servant, exercising our different talents in the way we make a living. And in the culture, as rulers, subjects, and citizens." Veith continues, "We also have a vocation in the church, pastors, elders, organists, congregants. But the spiritual life is not to be lived out mainly in church and in church activities. Rather, when we come to church, we find the preaching of forgiveness for the sins we have committed in our vocations. Then through word and sacrament, our faith is strengthened. Our faith then bears fruit when we are sent back to our vocations in our families, our work, and our culture." End quote. Now, I know that was a long paragraph, but he's trying to flesh out what it was that was at the beginnings of this Reformation idea of work and vocation. Let me give you a couple more just to demonstrate this idea. One scholar, Ragusa, writes this: What you find then in Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, is not the annihilation of the natural, but its devaluation. The natural is incomplete in and of itself and needs to be complemented by Christianity and grace to raise it, or better yet, consecrate it to a higher order. The opposition then is not between the holy and the unholy, but between the consecrated and the profane. Now think about that for just a moment. It sounds like a lot of distinctions between Protestants and Roman Catholics, but if you say that the natural, the created order, is lacking something, and that it needs to be supplemented or added to by grace, and we're not talking about the salvation of souls for a moment, we're talking about the natural order, then ultimately what you arrive at is the fact that washing dishes and changing diapers and manufacturing cars are in some way deficient, are in some way less than. And thus, only the spiritual things infused by grace are really the callings of God. And that's where we could say the idea of work was prior to the Protestant Reformation. Ideas, as we know, have consequences. And so one of the ideas that the natural is deficient at that time in Roman Catholicism meant that all other work was secondary. It was deficient. Ragusa continues, in short, the physical opposition of the natural and supernatural in Roman Catholicism is replaced by the reformers with an ethical opposition of sin and grace. He continues, the recreating power of grace then does not result in a second creation. And again, he's not talking about the salvation of souls here, just the natural order. The recreating power of grace then does not result in a second creation, nor does it add substantially to the already existing natural order. Rather, it is essentially reformation. And that means that during this period of time, the reformers, in addition to rediscovering the doctrine of salvation and rediscovering worship, because we could say that the Protestant Reformation was first about worship, moving then secondly to understanding justification by faith alone. Could also say that it was during the Reformation that a right view of vocation and calling and work was rediscovered.